Ava Thompson had spent the last few years carving out a path for herself that no one could have imagined. Growing up in a neighborhood where crime was common and opportunities scarce, she always dreamed of making a difference. Her passion for justice and her sharp mind led her to the highest echelons of power. Ava Thompson was the director of Homeland Security, a woman who had climbed the ladder of success through sheer determination and resilience. Yet, to some, she was still just another face in a crowd, easily overlooked and underestimated. And that's exactly what a group of corrupt cops thought when they decided to frame her for a crime she didn't commit. It all started with a routine traffic stop. Ava had just finished a meeting with some colleagues in the city. She was exhausted, but the day had been productive. As she made her way back to her car, she was caught in a slow-moving traffic jam, and the city's usual chaos pressed in on her from all sides. She had seen it all: the honking horns, the aggressive drivers, and the people too impatient to wait. Ava didn't mind it much. She was used to the noise, the pace. What she wasn't used to, however, was the flashing red lights of a police cruiser pulling up behind her. The cop who got out of the car was tall, with a stony expression, and he didn't seem particularly interested in making small talk. He approached her vehicle with a heavy step, and Ava's instincts kicked in. She hadn't done anything wrong, but she knew that sometimes people who had done nothing wrong found themselves caught up in situations they never expected. "License and registration," the officer said curtly. Ava nodded and reached into her glove compartment, pulling out the necessary paperwork. She handed it over, but her eyes remained steady on the officer. Something about his demeanor didn't sit right with her. He didn't seem like he was going to let her go easily. "Is there a problem, officer?" Ava asked, her voice calm but assertive. The officer didn't respond right away. He glanced at her paperwork and then back at her, studying her face like he was looking for something. Ava's mind raced, trying to figure out what was going on. She was in no hurry to leave, but she didn't like how tense the situation had become. Another officer joined him, a bit shorter but no less stern. The second cop, whose name Ava didn't catch, walked over to her window and leaned in slightly, his eyes scanning her face for any sign of guilt. "Step out of the car, ma'am," the first officer said, his tone flat and commanding. Ava's stomach tightened. She knew her rights. She knew she didn't have to get out of the car unless there was a reason, but something told her that refusing would make things worse. She was a woman of authority, yes, but in this moment, she was just another black woman in a city where the police had a history of aggressive tactics. "Is there a reason you're asking me to step out?" Ava asked, keeping her voice steady. She tried to remain calm, but there was a nervous flutter in her chest. "Just step out of the car, ma'am," the officer repeated, his voice now a little more insistent. "We've got reason to believe you're involved in a criminal investigation." Ava's eyebrows knitted together. This wasn't just a traffic stop anymore. Something about the way he said that sent a chill through her. She was being accused of something, but she couldn't imagine what. She had never been involved in anything illegal. She had worked hard to distance herself from the noise and chaos of the streets she had once called home. "I'm not involved in anything," Ava said, her voice steady but firm. "If you have a reason to arrest me, then please tell me what it is." The officer hesitated, but only for a moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small baggie of white powder. Ava's eyes widened in shock. "We found this under your seat," the officer said, his voice now colder. "We'll be taking you in for questioning." Ava's heart skipped a beat. This was a setup. She knew it. There was no way this could be true. She hadn't been in that car long enough to have dropped anything, let alone something like that. The officers seemed unfazed by her shock, their expressions unwavering as they prepared to handcuff her. Ava had dealt with her fair share of difficult situations, but this was something entirely different. She had never felt so helpless in her life. Just as the officers were about to pull her out of the car, she quickly pulled out her phone and sent a single message to her assistant, instructing them to contact her legal team immediately. She couldn't allow herself to be dragged into this. She was the director of Homeland Security, for heaven's sake. This wasn't supposed to happen. The officers continued to move toward her, but now there was something in their eyes, something they hadn't counted on. Ava didn't look like just another woman on the street. She looked like someone who was used to authority, someone who held power, someone who could change the course of their careers with a single phone call. That was something the officers hadn't expected. Ava took a deep breath and prepared herself for what was about to happen next. She needed to stay calm. If she lost her composure now, she could lose everything. "What is this about?" Ava asked again, this time in a more controlled voice. "I don't know what you're trying to do, but I won't be a part of it." The officer who had originally pulled her over seemed taken aback by her calmness. He looked down at the baggie in his hand, as if suddenly unsure of his actions. "We have our reasons," the second officer said, his voice betraying a hint of nervousness. Ava recognized that. The unease in his voice told her that something wasn't right. These officers were not acting with the confidence of men who believed in their own righteousness. They were fumbling, unsure of how far they could push her before she pushed back. Ava knew she had to act fast. The officers didn't realize who they were dealing with. They didn't know her past or her position. They didn't know how many people were watching or how many connections she had in high places. But Ava wasn't about to wait for them to figure it out. Just as the officers were about to pull her out of the car, Ava made her move. She calmly reached for the door handle, unlocking it, and stepped out of the car, standing tall. She looked directly into the officer's eyes. "I am Ava Thompson, Director of Homeland Security," she said, her voice firm and unwavering. "And you've just made a big mistake." The officers' faces drained of color as the realization hit them. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The once confident cops now stood frozen, their plans unraveling before them. Ava had been calm, composed, and in control from the very beginning. She hadn't panicked, she hadn't lost her cool. She had known exactly how to handle the situation from the moment it started. And now, the corrupt officers were about to find out that they had underestimated her. Ava Thompson had always known that her journey to the top wouldn't be easy. Growing up in a neighborhood where opportunities were few and far between, she learned early on that if she wanted to succeed, she had to work harder than anyone else. She had to be better, smarter, and more resilient. But it wasn't just about surviving, it was about fighting for something bigger than herself, fighting for the community that raised her, and for the future she wanted to create for others. Her childhood had been far from perfect. Raised in a small, run-down apartment in a neighborhood filled with violence and crime, Ava was no stranger to hardship. Her mother worked long hours in a factory, and her father had disappeared when she was just a child. Ava was left to fend for herself much of the time, but it didn't make her bitter, it made her stronger. She spent hours in the local library, reading books that transported her to other worlds. She dreamed of one day leaving her rough neighborhood behind, but she also dreamed of coming back one day and changing it. Despite the challenges, Ava excelled in school. She was a natural learner, absorbing information quickly and thinking critically about the world around her. While many of her classmates had no plans for the future, Ava knew exactly what she wanted. She wanted to work in law enforcement, to protect people and fight for justice. But it wasn't an easy path, especially for a young black woman from a neighborhood like hers. She faced countless obstacles, from being underestimated by her peers to dealing with racial bias at every turn. But Ava was determined. She earned a scholarship to a prestigious college and, despite facing immense pressure to give up, she graduated with honors. Her degree in criminal justice opened doors that had once seemed closed to her. But even with her success, Ava never forgot where she came from. She knew that her success wasn't just her own, it was a reflection of every person who had helped her along the way. And it was a responsibility she carried with her every day. As she began working with various government agencies, Ava quickly made a name for herself as a sharp, dedicated, and no-nonsense professional. She climbed the ranks with impressive speed, never forgetting the people who had supported her along the way. But she was also aware of the power dynamics at play. She knew that being a black woman in such a high-ranking position was both a blessing and a challenge. She had to work harder than anyone else to prove her worth, to show that she belonged, and that she was capable of leading. But she did it. She became the Director of Homeland Security. It wasn't the title that mattered to Ava, though it was what she could do with the power she had earned. She fought tirelessly for reforms within the justice system, pushing for policies that would benefit underserved communities and ensure that no one, regardless of their background, was treated unfairly. She knew that the work was never done, that there was always more to be done to make the country safer and more just. But Ava never shied away from the work, she embraced it with both hands, always striving to do better and to be better. On the outside, Ava was calm and composed, the epitome of professionalism. But beneath that cool exterior was a woman who had fought for everything she had, a woman who carried the weight of her past with her but refused to let it define her. She knew that there were always going to be people who would try to hold her back, who would try to bring her down. But Ava didn't let that stop her. She kept pushing forward, using every setback as fuel for her drive. And then, one afternoon, everything changed. Ava was just returning from a meeting with the president and some top officials when the incident with the corrupt officers occurred. She had been on her way home, looking forward to a quiet evening when the unexpected happened. The moment she was pulled over by the officers, Ava's mind immediately went into high alert. She knew something was wrong. She could feel it in her gut. The situation felt off, and her instincts told her that this was no ordinary traffic stop. The officers didn't seem interested in being cordial or professional. Their tone was harsh, and their manner was aggressive. As they handed her the bag of white powder and accused her of being involved in a crime, Ava's heart sank. She knew that this was an attempt to set her up, but she couldn't understand why. Why would someone want to frame her? She had worked so hard to get to where she was, and now someone was trying to tear it all down in an instant. Despite the shock of the moment, Ava remained calm. She didn't panic, and she didn't raise her voice. Instead, she chose her words carefully, her mind racing as she processed the situation. She knew that she couldn't let these officers control the narrative. If they thought they could intimidate her, they were wrong. Ava wasn't going to let them get away with it. But she also knew that the longer she stayed there, the more dangerous the situation became. She had to act quickly. As she stood there, facing the officers who had underestimated her, Ava began to recall everything she had learned over the years. She remembered the lessons her mother had taught her, to always stay calm, to never show fear, and to think on her feet. Ava had faced tougher situations before, but this was different. This wasn't just about her career, it was about something far bigger, her integrity, her identity, and her ability to fight back against the system that had wronged so many people like her. In that moment, Ava made a decision. She wasn't going to be just another black woman in a system that would swallow her whole. She wasn't going to let these officers get away with their corruption. She had worked too hard to get here, and she wasn't going to let anyone take it from her. With the calm confidence of someone who had been through far worse, Ava reached for her phone and sent a message to her assistant, instructing them to call her legal team. She had no intention of letting this escalate any further. She knew that someone would have to pay for this. And Ava Thompson always made sure that justice was served. But the officers, oblivious to the magnitude of the woman they had just stopped, were still convinced that they could control the situation. They continued to pressure her, trying to break her, but Ava refused to let them. She held her ground, her mind racing as she formulated a plan. This was far from over. She wasn't going to let anyone frame her, especially not people like this. In the moments that followed, Ava's thoughts were clear. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for every person who had ever been falsely accused, every person who had ever been overlooked or underestimated. Ava Thompson was no ordinary woman. And she was about to make sure the world knew it. The tension in the air was palpable. Ava Thompson stood in front of the two officers, her mind racing with a mix of emotions. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. It wasn't the first time she had been under pressure, but it was different this time. These officers didn't know who they were dealing with. They were trying to accuse her of something she had never done, and they were about to find out just how badly they had miscalculated. The first officer, tall and imposing, seemed more annoyed than anything else. He held the small bag of white powder in his hand, like it was evidence of a crime he had just solved. Ava could see the smugness in his expression, the way he thought this was all part of the routine. He didn't know that he was playing with fire. He had no idea who she was. "You're coming with us," the second officer said, his voice a little shakier now. His partner hadn't seemed to notice, but Ava could feel the shift in the atmosphere. The younger officer, the one who had first joined the scene, was beginning to doubt his own actions. The fact that they had planted evidence in the car meant they thought they had complete control of the situation. But Ava wasn't just any citizen. They had no idea who they were about to arrest. "Am I under arrest?" Ava asked, her voice low but steady. She wasn't asking out of fear, but out of necessity. She needed to know if they were officially trying to charge her with a crime. It wasn't just the right question, it was the right tactic. If they were going to arrest her, she needed to understand how far they were willing to go. And she knew that asking the question would force them to reveal their cards. The tall officer paused, looking at his partner before answering. It was almost as if he was trying to calculate how to respond to her. "You are being detained for questioning," he said. His tone was cold, and it only served to make Ava even more determined. She wasn't going to let them have the satisfaction of seeing her shaken. She had been through worse situations, and this wasn't going to be one of them. As the officers made another move toward her, Ava's hand brushed against her pocket, where her phone was tucked away. She had already sent a message to her assistant, instructing them to reach out to her legal team, but she knew that time was ticking. She wasn't going to allow this situation to get out of hand. She had to act fast. Ava stood her ground, her eyes never leaving the officers. "I don't think you understand who you're dealing with," she said, her voice quiet but full of authority. She could see the flicker of uncertainty in their eyes. For a split second, they seemed to hesitate. That was all the opening she needed. "I am Ava Thompson, Director of Homeland Security," she said, her voice unwavering. She didn't shout, she didn't get loud, she simply stated the truth. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of her position. She wasn't just a woman off the street. She wasn't some random citizen who could be brushed aside. Ava Thompson had a reputation, a history of leadership, and a network of powerful people behind her. And those officers had just made the mistake of underestimating her. For a moment, the officers stood frozen, staring at her in disbelief. The tall officer's hand trembled slightly, and the younger one took a step back, his face turning pale as the realization began to dawn on him. Ava could see that they were finally processing the magnitude of the mistake they had just made. They hadn't been dealing with a helpless victim, they had been dealing with someone who had the power to bring everything crashing down. "Director Thompson," the younger officer stammered, his voice barely audible. He looked at his partner, who was still trying to piece together what was happening. This can't be right." "We didn't know." "No, you didn't," Ava replied, cutting him off. "But now you do. And you've made a very dangerous mistake." Her words were firm, but she didn't let anger cloud her judgment. Ava knew that anger wouldn't help her here. She had to be strategic. The moment she revealed who she was, everything changed. It wasn't just a matter of her identity, this was a matter of power, influence, and accountability. Ava was the head of an agency that had access to a vast network of resources, and she wasn't afraid to use them when necessary. The officers glanced at each other, their confusion growing. Ava knew they were trying to figure out how they could undo the mess they had made. But there was no way to undo it now. The truth was out, and Ava had no intention of letting them sweep this under the rug. "I'm calling this in," Ava said, pulling out her phone and dialing her assistant's number. She could feel the officer's eyes on her as she spoke, but she didn't care. She needed to take control of the situation. She needed to make sure they knew exactly who they were dealing with. As her assistant picked up the phone, Ava spoke quickly, giving them instructions to contact her legal team, as well as the appropriate federal agencies. Within seconds, she could feel the shift in the officer's posture. The confidence that had once filled the air had dissipated, replaced by the uncomfortable awareness that they were no longer in charge. They had expected to walk away from this with nothing more than a successful frame-up. But Ava wasn't just another person they could push around. She wasn't some random civilian they had just tried to arrest, one of the most powerful women in the country. The younger officer shifted nervously, glancing at his partner. Ava could see the regret starting to settle in on his face. He had been just another pawn in the game, but now he was beginning to understand the magnitude of the situation. This wasn't just a mistake, it was a serious crime. And it wasn't just going to disappear because they decided to apologize. "You don't know what you've done," Ava continued, her voice calm and steady. "But you will soon enough." She was no longer just a victim of their mistake, she was the one in control. The officers had tried to manipulate the situation, thinking they could get away with framing someone who was just a name and face to them. But they were wrong. Ava had seen this kind of corruption before. She had fought it for years. And now, it was time to make sure it was eradicated once and for all. The minutes that followed were filled with tension as Ava's assistant contacted the legal team and the necessary authorities. The officers stood in silence, realizing the weight of what they had just tried to do. Their attempt to frame Ava had backfired spectacularly, and now they had no choice but to face the consequences. Ava could almost feel the panic in the air as their situation grew more dire with each passing second. The younger officer turned to his partner, and Ava could see the silent exchange between them. They knew they were trapped. But Ava wasn't concerned with their fear. She was focused on making sure they couldn't hurt anyone else. She had been underestimated far too many times, and now she was going to ensure that this was the last time anyone would dare to make the same mistake. Within moments, the sound of sirens in the distance reached her ears. Ava wasn't sure whether the officers had called for backup, or if someone higher up had already been alerted. Either way, it didn't matter. Ava had already taken control of the situation. It was only a matter of time before the rest of the pieces fell into place. And when they did, the corrupt officers would learn the hard way that Ava Thompson wasn't someone you could mess with. The sound of approaching sirens grew louder as Ava stood calmly, watching the two officers who had once been so confident now shift uncomfortably in their boots. They were trying to hold it together, but it was clear from their nervous glances and the way their bodies stiffened that they had no idea how to handle the mess they had just created. Ava, on the other hand, remained composed, her mind sharp and focused. She had been in tougher situations before. This was nothing more than a bump in the road. But to these officers, it was becoming a nightmare they couldn't escape. Ava didn't feel the need to say anything more. The moment she had revealed her identity, the tables had turned. She had never been one to flaunt her position, but there was a time and place for everything. This was that time. The officers had tried to make her a victim, and now they were the ones facing the consequences of their actions. As the sirens grew louder, the first officer, the one who had been the most assertive, reached into his jacket and pulled out his radio. His fingers were shaking slightly as he spoke into it, but his voice still carried that same authoritative tone. "We need backup," he said, his voice betraying the tension in his words. "Possible escalation. Officer down." Ava raised an eyebrow. "You're calling for backup? After trying to frame me?" She didn't need to raise her voice to make her point. Her calmness spoke volumes. She knew exactly what he was trying to do. He was attempting to cover up his mistake by getting more officers involved. But the moment they arrived, they would see the truth. The officers had no way out now. The situation had spiraled out of their control. The younger officer, still trying to wrap his head around the reality of the situation, looked from Ava to his partner, his eyes wide. He seemed lost, unsure of what to do next. Ava could see the internal conflict in his face. He was a rookie, probably just a few years out of the academy, and he had been thrown into something far bigger than he could handle. But that wasn't her problem. Ava had no patience for people who made excuses for their wrongdoings. She had worked too hard to get where she was to let a couple of corrupt cops ruin everything she had built. The first officer, realizing that calling for backup wasn't going to change anything, put his radio down. He was now fully aware of the position they were in. Ava wasn't just a citizen with some influence, she was a force to be reckoned with. And they had just tried to take her down for a crime she didn't commit. The seconds dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. Ava's phone buzzed in her pocket, and she knew it was her legal team calling. She didn't need to check the screen to know that they were already on their way. By now, her assistant had no doubt informed the higher UPS in Homeland Security, and soon, the officers' careers would be over. It was a simple matter of time. The corruption they had attempted to pull off would be exposed, and their actions would have repercussions far beyond just this incident. Ava wasn't going to let them get away with it. The younger officer looked at Ava once again, his face pale. "We didn't know who you were," he said, his voice almost pleading. "We thought you thought I was just another black woman you could frame," Ava finished for him, her voice as calm as ever. "You thought you could get away with it, and now look where we are." The young officer winced, as if her words were a slap to the face. He couldn't deny the truth. He had been a part of this corrupt scheme, and now he was standing on the edge of a cliff, about to fall into the consequences of his actions. He knew there was no way out. Even if he tried to escape the fallout, the evidence was already building against him. The senior officer, on the other hand, stood stiffly, his eyes darting between Ava and the approaching sirens, knowing that they had no choice but to face what was coming. Ava turned her attention back to the situation at hand. She wasn't here to lecture them or make them feel guilty. She was here to make sure that justice was served, and that meant using every resource at her disposal. Her phone buzzed again, and this time, she glanced at the screen. It was a message from her assistant, confirming that the legal team and the federal authorities were on their way. Ava knew that the wheels of justice were already turning. By the time the backup officers arrived, it would be clear to everyone what had happened. The officers who had tried to frame her would soon be exposed, and they would have no choice but to answer for their actions. "I want you both to stay right where you are," Ava said, her voice firm and unyielding. "Do not move until the proper authorities arrive." The younger officer looked like he wanted to protest, but he didn't say a word. He knew better than to challenge her now. Ava had already taken control of the situation. The officers had no more power here. In fact, it was hard to see them as anything more than two men caught in a lie they had created. But Ava wasn't interested in wasting time with them. She had made it clear that she wasn't afraid, and now it was their turn to face the music. Minutes later, the backup officers arrived. They parked their cars at a distance, watching from afar as the scene unfolded. Ava could tell they had been briefed on the situation. There was no confusion in their eyes as they approached. They had heard the news Ava Thompson was involved, and that meant the game had changed. They were no longer there to protect the officers who had tried to frame her. They were there to do their job and get to the truth. Ava turned to the new officers as they approached, nodding toward the two original officers who were still standing in front of her. "These two tried to frame me for a crime I didn't commit," she said calmly, her voice carrying the weight of the moment. "They planted evidence in my car and tried to make it look like I was involved in something criminal." The backup officers exchanged glances, but there was no doubt in their minds. They had heard of similar incidents before, but this was different. This wasn't just a random arrest gone wrong, it was a calculated attempt to ruin someone's life. And the person they had chosen to target was the Director of Homeland Security. It was an audacious and reckless move, and now it was time for the truth to come out. One of the backup officers, a woman with short, dark hair, stepped forward. "We'll take it from here," she said, her voice steady and professional. She turned to the first officer, who was still standing stiffly by the car. "You're going to be questioned about your actions. You'd better have a good explanation for what you've done." The younger officer looked like he was about to speak, but Ava cut him off. "No more talking," she said, her voice sharp. "The time for excuses is over." The officers were quickly handcuffed and escorted to the police cars. Ava watched as they were taken away, the weight of the moment finally sinking in. This wasn't just about her. It was about standing up for everyone who had ever been mistreated or falsely accused. This was a reminder that power could be used for good or for bad, but it always came with consequences. As the backup officers began their investigation, Ava took a deep breath. The storm was far from over, but she had already won the battle. The corrupt officers had been exposed, and soon, they would be held accountable. But Ava knew that there was still work to be done. There were more people like them out there, more corruption to root out. And Ava Thompson wasn't going to stop until the job was done. The day had been long, and Ava felt the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on her. The sirens that had blared earlier were now silent, the chaos of the moment fading into a quiet tension. As she watched the officers being driven away, the realization hit her: this wasn't just another confrontation, this was a turning point. A moment when everything she had worked for had been tested, and she had come out on top. But it wasn't over. The battle had been won, but the war for justice, for fairness, was far from finished. Ava had never been one to rest on her laurels. She had worked her entire life to get where she was, and she wasn't going to stop now, not when there was still so much to be done. As the officers were taken away, the backup team began their investigation. Ava stood to the side, her arms crossed, watching as the new officers took control of the scene. The air was thick with the kind of tension that only accompanies the aftermath of a major conflict. Ava could see the officers doing their work, processing the evidence, taking notes, and asking questions. They were thorough, and Ava could tell that they were already piecing together the full story of what had happened. She felt her phone vibrate in her pocket. It was her assistant again, and she didn't need to look at the screen to know that it was good news. Her legal team was already on their way, and federal agents were being called in to oversee the investigation. This wasn't just a local problem anymore, it was a national issue, and Ava had made sure that the right people would be involved. She pulled out her phone and checked the message. It was brief, but it confirmed what she already knew: the wheels of justice were in motion. The officers who had tried to frame her would be held accountable, but Ava knew this was just the beginning. There were so many more systemic issues that needed to be addressed. She had started a chain reaction, and there was no turning back now. The thought of what was to come next filled her with both relief and resolve. She had faced down corruption before, but this was different. This wasn't just a matter of fixing one wrong, it was about making sure that this kind of thing didn't happen again. It was about ensuring that people who used their power for evil didn't get away with it. It was about using her position not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been overlooked, mistreated, or unfairly targeted. Her mind shifted back to the officers, the two men who had tried to destroy her life. She knew they were just two people, but their actions represented something bigger. They weren't isolated figures, they were part of a system that allowed corruption to thrive. Ava had spent years fighting against that system, and this was just one small battle in a much larger war. But it wasn't just about rooting out corruption. It was about building a future where no one had to worry about being targeted because of their race, their gender, or their background. It was about creating a world where justice was not just something people talked about but something people could actually count on. Ava sighed, her thoughts shifting to the community she had come from. She thought of the people who had raised her, the people who had fought for change in their own ways, often without recognition. The community that had shaped her had always believed in the power of resilience. They knew that nothing came easy, but they also knew that it was possible to make a difference. She thought about her mother, who had worked tirelessly to provide for Ava and her siblings. Despite the long hours and the exhaustion, her mother never stopped believing in Ava. She never once told her that she couldn't do something because of where she came from or the color of her skin. She had taught Ava that the world wasn't going to hand her anything, but if she worked hard enough, she could earn it. And that lesson had stayed with Ava every single day of her life. Ava's reflection was interrupted as one of the backup officers approached her. She recognized him immediately as the woman who had spoken earlier, the one who had taken control of the situation when the other officers were still trying to figure out what had gone wrong. The officer was calm and professional, but there was a warmth to her presence that Ava appreciated. "We've got everything under control here, Director Thompson," she said, her voice steady and reassuring. "Thank you for your patience." Ava nodded, her gaze moving past the officer to the scene. "I just want to make sure this doesn't happen again," she replied. "We can't keep letting people like them slip through the cracks. There has to be accountability." The officer's expression softened. "That's what we're here for," she said. "We'll make sure this gets handled properly. You can count on that." Ava felt a small sense of relief. The officer's words were more than just polite reassurance, they were a promise. Ava wasn't alone in this fight. She had the backing of people who shared her commitment to justice, and together, they could make sure that the system worked the way it was supposed to. But even as she stood there, watching the investigation unfold, Ava knew that the battle wasn't over. It wasn't just about making sure these two officers paid for their actions, it was about ensuring that the system itself could be trusted again. She needed to be sure that this wasn't just an isolated incident, that there weren't other officers out there who thought they could get away with corrupt behavior. It was then that she realized how much more work lay ahead of her. The federal investigation into the officers would likely take time, and there were bound to be complications. But Ava knew that she was in the perfect position to make sure things moved forward. She had the power, the influence, and most importantly, the resolve to push through whatever came next. As the backup officers finished their work and began to clear the scene, Ava made her way back to her car. Her mind was already racing ahead to what needed to be done next. She couldn't afford to slow down, not when so much was at stake. She had come too far to let the setback derail her. She wasn't going to let these officers define her story. She wasn't going to let them or anyone else control her narrative. Ava knew that her next steps would be critical. The public needed to know what had happened, and the system needed to be held accountable. But even more than that, the people who had worked so hard to bring her down needed to see that corruption, no matter how deeply entrenched, could be defeated. Ava Thompson wasn't just a symbol of power, she was a symbol of resilience, of what could happen when someone refused to back down in the face of adversity. As she got into her car, she took a deep breath and looked out the window. The city was bustling, as always, but for Ava, everything had changed. She wasn't just a part of the system anymore, she was working to reshape it. And no matter how long it took, she would keep fighting, for herself, for the people who had supported her, and for everyone who had ever been wronged by the system. She wasn't done yet. This was just the beginning.